We'll now move to a dialogue entitled Defensive Democracy, a Renewed Perspective, with participants Professor Aaron Barak and Professor Matthias Kum. The discussion will be moderated by Professor Yoav Dotan, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and fellow at the Rubinstein Center for Constitutional Challenges. Professor Dotan, please.
Good afternoon. Originally, I intended to ask you both two questions, one referring to the past and one referring to the future. But I think Matthias took an issue with my first question, which was, to what extent do you see the shared trauma, in a way, or the traumatic past of World II? To what extent do you think it affected the current constitutional arrangement in both in Germany and in Israel? And as I said, I think Matthias, at least for Germany, took issue with this question already, but I'll give you a chance to expand on it, and for Justice Barak to refer to it in relation to the fundamental arrangement in Israel. And as already mentioned, there are shared, the fundamental constitutional arrangement in Israel and Germany are sharing some basic concepts, such as the concept of human dignity as the main pillar of the constitutional order. So this is one question referring to the past. But I have another question that refers to the future, or to our contemporary events that we all undergo, and that is, to what extent these fundamental arrangements in both systems are equipped to deal with perhaps the most conspicuous phenomenon of our time, that is democratic backsliding. We know that democratic backsliding is taking part in many areas, in many countries, many systems around the world, and both in the United States, in Europe. It includes Germany, but not only Germany. It includes the UK, it includes France and many other systems, and unfortunately for us, we envisage democratic backsliding also in Israel. So my question is to both of you, to what extent the current constitutional arrangements are equipped to deal with democratic backsliding, or maybe more generally, to what extent constitutional arrangements, any constitutional arrangements, can effectively guarantee human rights in the reality or against the background of democratic backsliding. So how do you want?
Let me refer to your second question, as I think Matthias Kum touched the first one. I don't believe, you will be surprised from what I'm saying, I don't believe that courts can prevent a democratic country, a liberal democratic country, to become an illiberal democratic country or dictatorship. I don't believe courts can do it. Courts can prevent it going quickly, can prevent it going very smoothly, but the court cannot prevent the people from achieving what the people want. The court is a limited institution with limited resources, with limited knowledge, and don't expect the courts to prevent, the courts in any country, in Israel, the courts in Israel to prevent this sliding that you were talking about. Only one body can prevent it, and this body is the people. And it can happen in Israel by elections that we are supposed, hopefully will have at the end of next year. The court cannot act against the will of the people. Even if you will have a provision in the constitution that you cannot amend the constitution, etc., there's always this power of the people. There is, of course, another little question: can there be limits on the power of the people under those circumstances? That's another question.
I agree with that, not surprisingly. But it's one thing to say, and I also assume that probably Aaron Barak will agree with that, it's one thing to say courts will not save committed people to go to hell in a handbasket if they're committed to doing so. But it's different, that is different from saying that there's no role courts could productively play to increase the chances of that not happening as quickly, or maybe not at all, because sometimes time is of the essence. So, for example, it's an interesting hypothetical. What would have occurred if the National Socialist Workers' Party, which was prohibited in 1923 after Hitler attempted a putsch against the Weimar Republic, if it had remained prohibited as it was as a result of the putsch. Because there was a law at the time which said that if a party did not stick to the rules of the game, then it could be prohibited on that grounds. But then Hitler came out of jail a year later and said, we now believe in the rules of the games. We'll comply with the formal procedural rules of the Weimar Republic, and we'll play the game and we'll try to capture the power by legal means. And then that was permitted. But now imagine, at that point in time, there had been a rule which said, A, such a party remains prohibited, as it would be under the German Basic Law today. And secondly, let's also assume there's a rule which says somebody who attempts a putsch like Hitler did would not be able to run for office anymore at all. So this is like in Brazil, for example, where Bolsonaro tried to do a Trump following his loss of elections and tried to instigate or try to create a situation where he would have a chance to maintain power. And as a result of that, within 3 months of that happening, there was an electoral court's decision, which as an administrative sanction, this is not a criminal procedure, it just said, okay, your behavior violates certain kind of basic norms of democratic appropriateness, and therefore you are now precluded from running for office for the next 10 years. And that's a death sentence for a politician. And so imagine the United States had done that to Trump, which they had arguably the legal basis of doing in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which the court interpreted, the Supreme Court, and then strangely said, and this was genuinely strange, that actually that particular provision requires implementation by Congress, knowing that would never happen under the real life circumstances, and therefore had no practical purpose. But there was a legal basis to basically preclude Trump from running for office. And I think that would not have solved everything. Trump is just a symptom. The problems go much deeper than that character or that movement that he stands for. But I do think persons matter. And I do think the possibilities of turning these difficulties into something more constructive may depend on the personnel that's available. And it may depend, on the one hand, negatively, on pulling certain persons out of the game. But of course, it also depends positively on there being attractive and ambitious politicians who stand for something better. So in the end, I do think that all these constitutional rules, they matter, but they are not ultimately going to save a political community, but they have a role to play.
Just to say that I agree, of course. And because I agree, you remember my remarks several minutes ago, that the court should not go into the bunker. Because going into the bunker means we will not play a role, which we may play. No, they should play a role as much as they can. And they can prevent many, many bad things. But when worse comes to worse, and the people are against the whole thing, then comes my remark that there are limits to what the court can achieve.
I would like to refer to this comparison between the US and Brazil. I think what made the difference between the US and Brazil, if you try to think, because the similarities between the US and Brazil are enormous in almost any respect. It's both, they have the same government structure, the same more or less the same share of power between the three branches, and also the fact that are related to the rise of populism in both systems are very much similar, simply because Bolsonaro just imitated Trump, or he tried to imitate Trump almost on any level. So if you ask yourself, what is the main reason for the difference, the huge difference in the chain of events, in what happened in Brazil and the United States, I would argue that this is a structure of the judicial system. That is, unlike in the United States, in Brazil, the STF, the Supremo Tribunale Federale, has concentrated power. That is, they are not only the Supreme Court, they are also the court that is in charge of enforcing criminal law against political corruption, and they have powers, as you mentioned, to oversee the electoral system. So it's not exactly the same tribunals, but it's more or less the same figures. So then, while in the United States, you don't have any of this. If you look at the criminal proceeding against Trump, they were completely diffused and dispersed between different courts, different prosecutors, and so forth. So I think it's not only people, but I think it's something that has to do with the structure of the judicial system. Now, if I go back to Israel in that respect, we are somewhat in the middle of the way. If you look at the structure of the judiciary, in the middle of the way between Brazil and the United States, in terms of the concentration of power within one court, because we do have one prominent institution, the High Court of Justice, Bagatz, which has many powers, but they don't have the same powers as the Brazilian Supreme Court has. For example, they don't have direct power, or I mean, what I'm saying is not completely accurate, because theoretically they can throw somebody out of the legal system, but it's not as easily it cannot done as easily as it was done in Brazil and smoothly, and it is not entrenched in the constitution. It's just a development of court law, of precedents. So I wonder, what's your take about that?
Well, I don't know too much about the Brazilian system. I was always amazed that the judges in Brazil are sitting and they have to discuss the case not in chambers, not among themselves, but before the public. And I was amazed. How can you do that? How can a court operate so openly? But probably there is a way to do it, which I don't know. I do think that the Israeli courts, the Israeli Supreme Court, has the powers which are needed to prevent it. A coup by the president, as it was in Brazil. And I think it's very important that our election committee is subject to judicial review. Whatever the election committee decides is subject to judicial review. And what is also provided, that a judge of the Supreme Court is the president of the election committee. It's very important. I hope they're not going to change it. So I think in terms of your question, our Supreme Court has almost or most of the powers which are needed to prevent a coup of Brazilian type.
I think it's very likely that the structure of the court system matters. But it's not decisive in these cases, I don't think. So I think if you ask, what is the core difference between, and I can only speak of Brazil and the United States, not so much for Israel, is that the timing. So these kinds of issues need to be dealt with swiftly. That means if you have a serious violation of the law, January 6 in the United States, 2021, the procedure needs to take place and be resolved in 2021. Because in 2021, everyone would have understood these procedures to address that particular act and that particular problem and address it irrespective of what the potential of that candidate is for future elections. By the time this actually came up to the Supreme Court, this is already 2024. He was already the Republican candidate and he was polling well. It seemed he might have a chance to win the elections, which of course in the end he did. And if the court had intervened at that point in time, it would have been seen as a clear intervention in a democratic process, pulling out a very promising candidate that might just win elections to favor another one. That's terrible. If that had happened, if the Supreme Court had decided differently at the point of time it was asked to decide, which is very late in the game, it would have been, the consequences could have been quite terrible. It would not have been a productive intervention. So I kind of have sympathy for the court doing with something that legally was deeply dubious and not very persuasive. But as a matter of statesmanship, kind of makes sense. But I don't think that's the whole story. I think the core issue is, and this goes to something that Aaron Barak said earlier. The intuition on the US Supreme Court is, and it's a misguided one, it's wrong, and Aaron Barak is right, which is to stay clear of anything that looks like a real political conflict. So we see this across the board, whether it's decisions relating to gerrymandering, whether it's campaign finance, whether it's anything that goes to the structure of the political process. There is an idea, John Hart Ely was famous for suggesting, that the core task of a constitutional court, it shouldn't meddle in too many things, but it should be the guardian of the fairness of the democratic process. That at least it should do. And the current US Supreme Court takes a position which basically says, if it's political, we regard it as a political question. This is a political question. If all we have is abstract standards of equality, with regard to gerrymandering, for example, then let the political parties do as they deem fit. And we will not review that. That's a political question. So there is the tendency to basically preserve themselves, I think this is what's driving it, by stepping back. And I think that's a very dangerous and ultimately counter-effective strategy. But if we want to see how that strategy plays out, then the United States currently is in Exhibit A to see how that plays out, because that is the strategy of the Supreme Court.
Just to add, in this respect of the timing you mentioned, Matthias, our court and our system allows those decisions that needed to be taken quickly. Because in Israel, you can go straight from the petition you have, from your complaint, straight to the Supreme Court. You don't have to go to other courts. You can go straight to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court can immediately give an order naisi, asking what's wrong here, and it can very quickly require the response of the state, and then can very quickly make a decision. In this respect, our system has this tool that you were talking about, and it's very, very important to use this tool. And therefore, I'm always hesitant when a case comes and the judges say, well, it's an interesting question. We don't have to decide it now. We will decide it sometime later. No, 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 no. In the times of today, you have to decide it now. You have to decide it quickly within the context that we have, and don't postpone it. And this can be done, and to the extent I know it, as I read the judgments, this is basically what they do. Not always I'm happy with the way it was drafted, but basically this is the result the courts have in Israel. So we have this very, very not natural situation where you go straight to the Supreme Court, so you save all the time. And the court having this power, don't give it up. Use it whenever those cases are coming, and think not only about case A, case B, case C, but think about what happens, case A, B, C, D, E. Think about the context in which we are. If you do that, you can help the people not to fall into a non-liberal democracy.
Yes, I fully agree with both of you that time is of the essence. But I think what Justice Barak just said, that the timing is affected by the structure of the judiciary. That is, whether you have concentrated or dispersed legal system. I think both in Brazil and in Israel, you have a concentrated system, and which is, I think, relatively unique in the sense that you can go directly to the highest institution of the land with no you don't need to pass any lower echelons. And this is something that is hardly can be done in the United States. It's not, I think theoretically the United States Supreme Court can take cases quickly if they want to, like they did, for example, after the elections of 2000. They dealt with it immediately, and they have this thing of the shadow docket and all that, but they don't normally do that, and they are not used to do it, like in Brazil and in Israel. And I think this is the main component that affects the timing of, or the timeline of the combat against democratic backsliding. Now, I think we have I think we can open the floor for questions from the audience now, the time that we have left. Anybody want to ask a question? Yes, please.
Thank you. The court, of course, is very important. But I asked, especially Professor Barak, how we defend the higher court. You see, today there is really a war against the court. So how can we defend it?
Well, I don't want to go too much into the Israeli specific political and other situation, but I do think the people can protect the court by many, many ways. They can, for example, demonstrate, go to the streets, say we believe the court, say we believe the president of the court. So there are means that within the militant democracy, people can do, even, and in some cases it may seem that what they are doing is illegal, which is a problem, especially a problem for me to defend illegal activity. And that's not what I'm doing. What I'm saying is that we, the people, have tools in order to make the court do its job. But that's not enough.
I'm sure many of you are aware, particularly given the debates as they are also taking place in Israel, the idea that somehow the judiciary is an undemocratic intervention on what otherwise would be a democratic process, etc. And there are all kinds of answers that have been given to that type of challenge. But the best answer is one that insists that an electoral accountability process and the possibilities of citizens being able to challenge, to contest the outcome of a majoritarian process before an impartial and independent tribunal, that these two things go deeply together. They're both ways of empowering citizens, and they're both at the heart of a concept of constitutional democracy. So the idea is not that there is democracy and then, well, then we might have something else to police the democratic process. Courts and the possibility to contest majoritarian decisions should be understood to be at the heart of a comprehensive democratic process. Now, for that, the court has to be adequately structured, and there are certain additional conditions that need to be fulfilled. But nonetheless, it's important, first of all, intellectually, to insist that the two are joined at the hips. And secondly, of course, and that's the important point, is it makes a huge difference whether people in a democratic community actually believe that and then go out on the streets. And if there are challenges to the institutions, are willing to defend that, to go out, mobilize, and insist that there's something of importance for them that would be lost if such an institution was either abolished or massively disempowered.
So, and I absolutely agree, and I think that also Israel has demonstrated the strength of its democracy during the recent couple of years. You know, Leonard Hand once said that democracy does not exist on paper. Democracy is what exists in the hearts of the people. And I think that the Israeli public has demonstrated that they have a very big heart for democracy throughout the last 2-3 years with all the difficulties. Any more questions? Go ahead, please.
Now, I'm not sure whether you're referring to, there was actually a new constitution enacted, so it wasn't just an amendment. This was the great criticism of Fidesz with regard to the previous constitution. They insisted that that the problem of the legitimacy of the previous constitution, which was perfectly compatible with liberal democracy, but it was basically only a subtly amendment version of the constitution that existed under the socialist regime. And so if you wanted to have a genuine free constitution, you needed a new one. And then it just so turns out that surprisingly nobody expected that. They had the majority to actually enact a new constitution, which they did. And then you have and now we're in a very different constitutional world. And now the question is, how would one imagine getting out of that? Again, well, how do citizens react? Well, I mean, at the moment, the governing coalition still enjoys strong support. It will be very difficult to change, to move beyond this in a deep structural constitutional way. So this raises all kinds of issues as to how you undo these types of acts which were a move from a liberal democracy to an illiberal democracy, to some kind of more authoritarian structure. And there are hard and difficult questions there, and we could have a whole seminar talking about them, but unfortunately there's no quick silver bullet-like answer that I can give to that question.
Please.
I want to continue my question. Professor, distinguished professor Barak spoke about demonstration. Well, demonstration, but it's not enough. I would like to know if there is something in the law or part of the constitution to fight during the judicial way against, to limit the power of the majority. What is done today?
Well, I think what Israel demonstrated, the strength of public protest, because on paper, our constitutional guarantees are pretty weak. We don't have an entrenched constitution. We have some basic laws, but formally, they are up to change by the Knesset by regular majority. So these are, from formal point of view, these are very weak constitutional guarantees. And yet, if you look at what happened in Israel in the last 3 years, although the government had a solid majority in the Knesset, and although they had the formal power to change the constitution, if you measure the actual success in transforming the Israeli constitutional system, their success was very limited. Largely speaking, so far, and knock wood, the so-called reform introduced by the government 3 years ago did not pass. They have passed here and there some relatively small changes. Maybe they succeeded in 2 or 3% of what they planned. And that was done with no constitutional, no formal, or with very weak formal constitutional guarantees, I think.
We have only a couple of minutes left, and I have, if it's not inappropriate, I have a question for you, Aaron. You were ad hoc judge on the ICJ when South Africa filed its petition against Israel for genocide. What was your experience of the institution of the process at the court? How do you come away from that process? Did it strengthen, did it undermine your faith in international institutions? What were your impressions in that regard?
I spent almost a year, less, in the ICJ. In Israel, there is a mixture between the ICJ and the ICC. Whenever now there was a decision by the International Criminal Court, the pictures they shown on TV is the ICJ. So I'm not talking about the ICC. As far as the ICC is concerned, I think that the arrest order that the court issued on the request of the prosecutor was wrong, and I have done my best. I tried to, because I have some connections with people around the prosecutor, I tried to convince them to abolish it, not because of my like or dislike to the people who were ordered, against whom this order was given, but because in my view, an order against the Prime Minister of Israel is an order against Israel. And this, I think, was wrongly done. So that put aside the ICC. Your question, rightly so, has to do with the ICJ. I was accepted by them open-handed. They knew my work. They read my books. And they knew, which I told them from the beginning, I'm not an agent of Israel, as you are not agents of the countries from where you come. We are agents of justice. And so let's see what does justice say in terms of international public law. And my feeling is that this is the way they think about it. For example, what I was faced was the request of South Africa to issue an order for Israel to stop fighting in Gaza. And I told the judges, you are asked to give an order to stop fighting in Gaza. Are you going to give also a judgment that the Hamas would stop fighting in Gaza? The answer is no. The court has no jurisdiction as far as Hamas is concerned. So it will be just an order against Israel. And then I cited to them one of my judgments in which I said that when a democracy fights terror, it fights with one hand behind its back. And it will prevail because the one hand it fights with is the hand of the rule of law. Now what you are asked to do is that Israel will fight with the two hands behind its back. And I think the judge understood it, accepted it, and I must say, even the president of the court then was a person who is now the Prime Minister of Lebanon. I knew him very well. And I gave him my books as a gift. And I hope I'll be able sometime to visit him in Lebanon, in peacetime, of course. So my belief in international law justice was strengthened, not weakened. I have seen the seriousness in which my views were taken. There, everything goes according to seniority, everything. So the junior starts, and the president, who is the senior, finishes. And so they accepted my view, and they understood the problem of Israel, and no order was given for Israel to stop fighting in Gaza. The order that was given was stop fighting in Gaza in a way that you commit genocide. And I think Israel was fighting in Gaza probably by violating some rules of humanitarian international law, but not genocide. And even the chief prosecutor, when he asked the orders against the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense, did not cite genocide as the reason for that, because he knows that genocide is the most serious criminal offense, that you need a very high, very, very high requirement of mens rea, namely of intent to commit genocide, and this very, very high intent was not there. The case is not over yet. It will take some years until it will be over. And probably one of my remarks is that they should do it quicker. But they have a lot of work. Don't think that they sit with, they have a lot of international problems, more important, less important. They have also not only the case that I was involved in, but they have also advisory opinions they have to give to the UN bodies, etc. It should go quicker. And I think that this shadow of genocide, and you can imagine, Matthias, how difficult it was, and I told it to them, how difficult it is for me, a Holocaust survivor, to sit on a case in which Israel, my country, not my principal, not the one who sent me, but my country commits genocide. And they understood it very well. So my belief in international law was not weakened by my experience. On the contrary, it was strengthened by my experience.
So our time is up, so thank you very much.